The porch rail sagged like a tired old man's shoulders. Silas Blackwood ran a calloused thumb over the splintered wood, the same spot his father used to stand every morning, surveying a kingdom that had since crumbled to dust. In his pocket, his fingers found the edges of the last $3 silver he owned. It was a meager sum, barely enough to cover the telegraph fee and the final payment for the arrangement he'd made out of sheer, bone-deep desperation. He had hired a bride, though the word felt like a lie in his mouth. He hadn't hired a wife, he had purchased a pair of hands. The advertisement in the San Francisco paper had been blunt: homestead rancher in Montana Territory seeks wife. Passage paid. Must be strong, willing to work. No illusions of comfort offered. He needed help. The 2 cows his father had left him were scrawny and barely producing, the fences were down in 3 sections, and the small patch of land he'd tried to cultivate had withered under the relentless summer sun. According to the Homestead Act, he had to show improvement, had to build a life on this claim, or the government would take it back. A wife, a family, was proof of permanence. A second worker was a chance at survival. He had imagined a stout German woman, or perhaps a hardy Irish widow who knew her way around a farm. Someone whose hands were already rough, whose face was already lined by hardship. Therefore, when the weekly freight wagon crested the dusty rise, Silas felt a knot tighten in his gut. It slowed, the driver hauling on the reins, and a small figure climbed down from the passenger seat. She was not stout. She was not a widow. She was a young Chinese woman, slender and composed, holding a single, dark wood chest. She wore a simple beige prairie dress, the fabric clean but worn, its practical cut a stark contrast to the delicate line of her jaw and the quiet intelligence in her dark eyes. She stood beside the wagon, waiting, as if she were a piece of freight to be claimed. Silas's heart sank. This was a mistake. A terrible, costly mistake. He walked toward her, his boots kicking up puffs of dry dirt. She watched his approach without a flicker of fear, her posture straight, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "You are Silas Blackwood?" she asked. Her voice was low and clear, with an accent that was present but did not obscure the precision of her words. He nodded, unable to find his own voice for a moment. "I am. My name is Lynn," she said. "I have come in answer to your notice." The wagon driver unloaded her chest with a thud, tipped his hat, and was gone in a cloud of dust, leaving the 2 of them alone in the vast, silent expanse of the failing ranch. The silence stretched, thick with the heat of the day and the weight of Silas's disappointment. He had pictured a partner in labor, not someone who looked like she might be broken by the first day's work. "The cabin's this way," he said finally, his tone gruffer than he intended. He picked up her chest. It was heavier than it looked. He led her to the small, clapboard house. It was 2 rooms, plus a lean-to he'd built for storage. That would be her room. He showed her inside, the sparse furnishings, the wood-burning stove, the table he'd made himself. He felt a hot flush of shame at the poverty of it all. "This is it," he said, gesturing vaguely. "The lean-to has a cot." Lynn said nothing. She set her hands on the rough-hewn table, her gaze sweeping the room, taking in the water bucket, the neatly stacked but meager firewood, the worn-out broom in the corner. Her eyes missed nothing. Then she looked back at him. "You wrote that the work was milking," she stated. It was not a question. "That's the start of it," he admitted, leading her back outside. He pointed toward the sorry-looking barn and the 2 thin Jersey cows listlessly flicking flies with their tails in the shade. "That's Bess and Daisy. They're not giving much. Barely enough for myself." He expected her to complain, to show some sign of dismay. Instead, she walked directly to the nearest cow, Bess, and stopped. She didn't reach out to touch it at first. She just watched, her head tilted. She observed the dullness of its coat, the slight tremor in its leg, the way it favored one side. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she ran a hand down the animal's flank, her touch surprisingly firm. She moved to its head, murmuring something too low for him to hear, and gently checked its teeth. Silas watched, bewildered. He had expected tears, or at the very least, a look of horrified regret. He had not expected this quiet, methodical assessment. Lynn straightened up and turned to face him, her expression serious. "Where is the clean water source?" she asked. "This trough is full of algae. It will sicken them." The question caught him completely off guard. He had been so focused on his own failure that he'd stopped seeing the details. He'd just been filling the trough from the dwindling creek, the same as his father always had. Her words were not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact, and in that moment, Silas Blackwood understood that the woman standing before him was not at all what he had paid for. She was something else entirely. The next morning, Lynn was up before him. When Silas entered the main room of the cabin, a small fire was already crackling in the stove, and the scent of chicory coffee hung in the air. She had already been to the barn. 2 buckets, scrubbed clean, sat by the door. One was a quarter full of milk, more than he'd gotten from both cows combined in a week. "The brown one, Daisy, her leg is swollen at the joint," Lynn said without preamble, not looking up from where she was straining the milk through a piece of cheesecloth. "She needs a poultice." Silas stared at the milk. "How did you?" "I gave them fresh water from the well by the house," she replied, her voice even. "And I found a patch of clover behind the barn. They are hungry for better forage." She had seen more in one afternoon than he had in a year of weary toil. A feeling of inadequacy, sharp and unwelcome, pricked at him. He was supposed to be the rancher. But there was no time for pride. They worked. He showed her how to mend the fences, and she learned quickly, her small hands surprisingly strong and nimble with the wire. He expected her to tire, but she worked at a steady, relentless pace, never complaining about the heat or the splinters. In the evenings, she would sit at the table, mending his torn shirts by the light of a single tallow candle, her stitches small and perfect. They spoke little, but a rhythm developed between them. A language of shared tasks, of tools passed without asking, of a pot of stew left on the stove for him when he came in late from the fields. He found himself watching her, struck by the economy of her movements. She wasted nothing, not a drop of water, not a scrap of cloth, not a single motion. One afternoon, a week after her arrival, disaster struck. He found Daisy lying on her side in the field, her belly swollen tight as a drum. Bloat. He'd seen it kill a neighbor's prize bull once. It was fast and it was fatal. A cold despair washed over him. It was just one more thing he was going to lose. "She's done for," he said, his voice flat. He turned to go for his rifle. It was the only kindness he could offer her now. "No," a firm voice said behind him. Lynn was there, her face set. "Get me oil. And bring a length of rope." He hesitated, but the authority in her tone was absolute. He did as he was told. When he returned, she had already gathered a bundle of pungent-smelling herbs from the edge of the creek. She crushed them with a rock, mixing them into the oil he brought. She worked with a focused intensity that held him mesmerized. "Hold her head," she commanded. Together, they forced the cow's mouth open, using the rope to keep it from biting down. Lynn carefully poured the mixture down the animal's throat, stroking its neck to make sure it swallowed. Then, she began to knead the cow's swollen side, her hands pressing and releasing in a steady, rhythmic motion. She worked for over an hour under the blazing sun, sweat beading on her brow, her beige dress stained with dirt and oil. Silas stood by, handing her tools, his initial despair slowly giving way to a grudging admiration. By evening, the swelling had begun to subside. Daisy was still weak, but she was on her feet. Lynn sat beside her, stroking her head, speaking to her in that same low, calm tone. Silas brought her a dipper of water. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "My village," she said simply, not looking at him. "We had many animals. We could not afford to lose them." He had hired a milkmaid, but he was beginning to suspect he'd found a partner. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. He was used to being alone with his failures. Sharing the possibility of success felt far more dangerous. Their small victory did not go unnoticed. A few days later, a rider approached the homestead. Silas recognized the expensive silver-inlaid saddle before he recognized the man. Marcus Thorne. Thorne owned the sprawling T-Cross ranch that bordered Silas's property to the north. He was a man who smiled with his mouth but never his eyes, a man who collected land the way other men collected stamps. Thorne reined in his horse, his gaze sweeping over the mended fence line, the healthier-looking cows, and finally settling on Lynn, who was hanging laundry on a line she had strung between the cabin and a cottonwood tree. "Blackwood," Thorne said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "I see you've acquired some help." His eyes lingered on Lynn, a flicker of something unpleasant in their depths. "Seems a shame to have such a delicate creature out here in this dust bowl." Silas's hand tightened on the axe handle he was holding. "She's my wife," he said, the lie coming more easily than he expected. It felt like a shield. Thorne chuckled, a low, patronizing sound. "Of course. Well, my offer still stands. I'll give you a fair price for this claim. Enough to set you and the lady up somewhere more comfortable. A man has to know when he's beat." The offer was an insult wrapped in false concern. Thorne didn't want the land for cattle, he wanted it for the creek that ran through it, the only reliable water source for miles. "The land's not for sale, Thorne," Silas said, his voice hard. Lynn had stopped her work. She stood by the clothesline, silent and still, her expression unreadable. But her unwavering gaze on Thorne seemed to unnerve the man more than Silas's anger. Thorne's smile tightened. "Suit yourself," he said, turning his horse. "But water has a way of running where it's wanted most." The words hung in the air long after he was gone. It was a threat. 2 weeks later, Thorne made good on it. The creek, which had been a steady, if shallow, flow, slowed to a trickle. Silas walked the length of it and found what he had feared. Upstream, on Thorne's property, a new, crudely built dam of rock and mud diverted most of the water into a holding pond for the T-Cross herd. It was legal, just barely, but it was a death sentence for his homestead. He returned to the cabin that evening, defeated. The small progress they had made felt like a joke. He slumped at the table, his head in his hands. The dust bowl Thorne had mocked was about to become a reality. He felt a light touch on his shoulder. It was Lynn. She said nothing, but placed a folded piece of paper on the table in front of him. He unfolded it. It was a map, hand-drawn with charcoal on a piece of wrapping paper, showing the contours of his land. But it also showed something else, lines and symbols he didn't understand, running deep beneath the surface. It was a map, he realized, not of his land, but of the water tables beneath it. In the quiet glow of the lantern, the cabin felt smaller, more intimate than ever before. The map lay between them, a silent testament to a knowledge Silas couldn't comprehend. "My father was an engineer," Lynn began, her voice soft, pulling Silas from his stupor. "He worked for the railroad, designing irrigation systems for the big farms in California. He believed water was not a gift from the sky, but a secret in the earth." She traced a line on the map with her finger, a line that ran right through the middle of Silas's most fallow field. "He taught me how to read the land. The way the plants grow, the shape of the rocks. He said you can always find the deep water if you know how to look." Her finger stopped at a spot marked with a small circle. "There," she said, her gaze meeting his. "There is a spring here. Deep. It is not a creek that a cruel neighbor can dam. It is a wellspring, fed from the mountains. It will not run dry." The certainty in her voice was a physical force. For the first time, a flicker of hope ignited in Silas's chest, a hope so fragile he was afraid to breathe on it. But it was followed by a wave of questions. "Lynn," he began, his voice hoarse. "Why? Why did you answer my advertisement? You're not meant for this kind of life." She looked down at her hands, folded on the table. They were no longer the smooth, delicate hands of the woman who had stepped off the wagon. They were chapped and healing, with a line of dirt etched permanently under her nails. They were the hands of a homesteader. "In my city," she said, "after my father died, I was bound to a man who owned a shop. My father had a debt. I was to work to pay it. But the man was not good. His eyes were like Mr. Thorne's. She shuddered, a barely perceptible movement. Your advertisement was not for a wife. I knew that. It was for a worker. It promised passage, a place to be. It was a way out. A chance to be free. She reached into the small wooden chest that held all her worldly possessions and pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal. She opened it on the table. The pages were filled with her father's elegant script and intricate diagrams of water pumps, windmills, and geological formations. It was her only inheritance. This is not just your land to lose, Silas, she said, her voice gaining a strength he had never heard before. I have no other place to go. I wish to earn a stake here. A partnership? This land can live. I know it can. The choice hung in the air between them. To believe her was an act of pure faith. Digging a well that deep would be back-breaking work. It would take every ounce of their strength, every moment of their time. If they failed, if she was wrong, they would have wasted the last precious weeks before winter, and Thorne would win without lifting another finger. Silas looked from the map, to the journal filled with impossible knowledge, to the steady, determined light in Lynn's eyes. He saw not a hired bride or a desperate runaway, but a partner. His partner. We start at dawn, he said. The decision had barely been made when the next blow fell. Marcus Thorne returned, but this time he was not alone. Beside him rode a portly man with a sheaf of papers and an air of weary authority. He was the territorial land agent. Blackwood, Thorne said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Agent Davis was just making his rounds, and I expressed my concern for your situation. Agent Davis dismounted, his eyes taking in the dry creek bed and the parched fields. The Homestead Act is clear, Mr. Blackwood. A claim must be improved. Cultivated. From what I see here, this land is failing. Mr. Thorne has filed a preliminary challenge to your claim, citing lack of viability. Silas's blood ran cold. It was a legal strangulation, and it was working. We're digging a well, Silas said, the word sounding hollow even to his own ears. The agent glanced at the spot in the field where they had just begun to break ground. He looked unimpressed. A lot of men dig dry holes, he said flatly. I'll give you 30 days. If by my next visit I don't see significant, tangible improvement, a working well, irrigated crops, I'll have no choice but to revoke your claim. The law is the law. He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving Silas and Lynn standing in the dust with a 30-day death sentence hanging over their heads. Thorne gave Silas a final, triumphant smirk before following the agent. The race was on. For months later, the autumn sun cast long, golden shadows across a landscape transformed. The sagging porch rail on Silas's cabin had been replaced with smooth, sturdy pine. But the real change was in the land itself. In the center of the main field stood a miracle of engineering, a windmill, its blades turning rhythmically in the crisp breeze. It was not a store-bought model, but one built from scrap lumber and salvaged metal, following a design from the leather-bound journal. It powered a pump that drew a steady, gushing stream of clear, cold water from the earth. That water, the lifeblood Lynn had promised, now flowed through a network of meticulously dug irrigation ditches, feeding fields that were no longer brown and barren. They were lush with a late-season crop of winter fodder, a vibrant green testament to their victory. The two scrawny cows, Bess and Daisy, were now the matriarchs of a small but healthy herd of 10. Their calves were strong, their coats were sleek, and their milk was so rich that Lynn had begun making butter and cheese. Once a week, Silas would take their surplus to the freight station in the nearest town, returning with cash money in his pocket, more than he had seen in 2 years. Agent Davis had returned at the end of the 30 days. He had walked the property in stunned silence, his gaze lingering on the ingenious windmill and the water flowing freely across the land. He had dismissed Thorne's challenge on the spot, declaring the Blackwood homestead a model of innovation and industry. Marcus Thorne had not been seen near their property line since. He had lost, and he knew it. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Silas was finishing the last of the repairs on the porch. He worked with a sense of peace he had never known, the feel of the solid wood under his hands a metaphor for the life he was finally building. The cabin door opened, and Lynn came out, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She handed one to him, and they stood together, leaning against the new rail, watching the day end. The silence between them was no longer awkward or uncertain. It was a comfortable, shared space, woven from months of shared labor, shared fears, and a shared triumph. He had come to rely on her quiet wisdom as much as her tireless work. He had learned the cadence of her speech, the rare, quick smile that would light up her face when one of the calves did something amusing, the way she would look out at the fields with a fierce, protective pride. He cleared his throat. The words he wanted to say felt too big for his mouth, too clumsy for the simple truth they held. He looked at her, at the way the fading light caught the soft curve of her cheek. He thought of the desperate man he had been, a man who thought he was buying a servant. And he looked at the woman who had saved him, who had seen a secret in the earth and had the courage to unearth it. He set his mug down on the rail and reached out, his large, calloused hand covering hers. She did not pull away. Her fingers curled slightly, a silent acknowledgement. "This is your home, Lynn," he said, his voice low and steady. "This land, this house. It's as much yours as it is mine. For as long as you want it." She turned her head to look at him, and her eyes held a warmth that rivaled the sunset. She looked from his face to the thriving ranch spread out before them, a kingdom they had built together from dust and determination. "Our home," she corrected softly. A slow smile spread across Silas's face. He knew then that the water she had found was not the only miracle on this homestead. The real treasure was the woman standing beside him. Together, they had taken a ruined piece of land and turned it into the jewel of the frontier. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.